All right, all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Charlie. And thank you to everyone at IGDA, Diego, for initially reaching out to me, and yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to give this kind of talk and to talk with y'all at the end of this kind of brief little lecture that I have. Just as a brief aside, before we get too far along here, I do want to make sure that I'm sharing audio um, on my shared screen. So let me just make sure. Oh yeah, share stream audio. Okay, cool. I think I'm all set. So yeah, I'm Nicholas O'Brien. I'm an artist and designer based in Brooklyn. I founded and run a kind of solo studio based in Brooklyn that's called SA Games, where I focus on making kind of nuanced narrative leaning projects. I made a game, or I released a game last year, last March, called Bundle of Joy, which is a game that's about becoming a parent during the pandemic, but the style of the gameplay is a WarioWare style game. So it's a bunch of mini games with these narrative vignettes interspersed within the mini games. It's intentionally stressful and somewhat high stakes, but also really fun and silly. And that's on Steam and Itch if you're interested in checking it out. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with this little presentation. It's called Interactive Storytelling for the Solo Game Developer, or a good kind of, I guess you can say, a good simple technique to try out for yourself. And that's a narrative design technique. So we'll be kind of looking at ways in which we can do that. And I'll also be sharing how I've done this with an upcoming project. Okay. Also, just like as an aside, I'm going to be reading from some notes. So if there's times where I'm a little bit more formulaic, it's because I want to make sure that I'm covering all the content that I want to cover. All right, so this talk is a modified version of a talk that I gave at Narrowscope, which is a narrative design and interactive fiction focused conference that rotates kind of in the Eastern Seaboard. It's upcoming its next location will be in Albany this year. And the talk that I gave there was called Relearning Narrative Design Lessons from Children's Books. And a lot of that talk kind of waxed poetic about my kids and their reading habits and what I observed from their impatience and precociousness as a game/narrative designer. But I wanted to kind of consolidate some of those thoughts from that talk and offer some ideas of how to use some of the techniques that I learned as a result of some of that research in potentially your own projects. So I'll show some examples of what I'm talking about in AAA and indie games, and then also give a little sneak peek of how I'm thinking about this in an upcoming project that I've started to prototype. So in that previous talk at Narrowscope, I shared some anecdotes about reading to my kids and seeing how even with kind of cursory or really sleepy reads, my children could actually piece together story beats and recount back to me memorable moments. And at first I thought this was just my kiddos having like route memorization skills, but as I saw it expressed over many different types of books, I began to wonder if it was actually part of my child's literary sophistication being controlled or overseen by the result of very good design. And so what I found, though, was that the hurried reading habits of my ever so sweet kiddos and their glossing over what I, as a writer and designer, would have probably have spent the most amount of time poring over was the details. And that's where I really like to work. What I saw from my kind of page skipping toddlers was that this kind of glimmer of a begrudging familiarity that I've witnessed in playtesting events and just showcasing my game in some general audiences that encounter narrative games. And I saw an impatient gamer button mashing to skip through a detailed narrative. And I get it, right? Like we've all been there. We've been sitting down with our Switch or our Steam Deck or our preferred retro handheld console, and we flip it on, we load up a save file, we remember where we last left off, and we try to dive right into gameplay. And then, some pesky NPC starts talking to us. And they're probably saying something really important and expertly crafted, but we're holding down the X button to load, advance, or skip through whatever it is that they're saying. Because we want to get back to the action, right? Especially when we have so few hours in our increasingly crowded days. We don't want some lore drop or to get in the way of us leveling up or whatever. But as a designer, the thought that anyone would want to skip over my lovingly crafted narrative, makes my skin crawl. Watching my own flesh and blood, my progeny committing this horrific offense was betrayal of the highest order. Like, how could they? Didn't they know that Papa loves details and storytelling? So what, as a designer, am I to do with a sleepy child or a trigger-happy player? And now there are many answers to this question and many methods available to narrative designers or writers to tackle this conundrum. And for the purpose of this talk and what you might be making in your own games, I want to encourage you to think about how your systems could strategically implement one interactive story technique that can be applied throughout your design. And this is called the layer cake technique. I was originally introduced to this layer cake technique by Susan O'Connor while enrolled in her course at the narrative department. And she attributed this technique to a former mentor of hers, Patrick Redding. Redding was the narrative director for Far Cry 2, which O'Connor was also a writer on. And Redding and his team wondered how the complex story that they wanted to craft could appeal to players who only played first-person shooters. And so at the time, and maybe a little bit to this day, the core demographic of first-person shooter gamers weren't really playing for the plot necessarily. So for Far Cry 2, there became this design challenge for creating compelling narrative for a range of players intrigued by the story that the designers wanted to tell. And they devise what became known for O'Connor and others as the layer cake technique. So let's look at how this actually works in action. And apologies if this is like high sound to begin with. I'll turn it down. I think it should be okay.
How are you? You made it out. I didn't introduce myself before. My name is Flora Guyen. You still have that malaria, though, don't you? You see that man over there? He has medicine. You go ask him, he might give some to you. Take those pills, Kampai. You need them.
Oh, you people never stop. Here's the bloody tip, all right? That's it. That's all I've got. Well, aren't you going to destroy it? That's what your friends usually do. Wait, you're not here for the tips, are you? Oh, I see the problem now. You can get the pills you need from the church in Pala. The priest there will help you, assuming you make it in time. Just pass this along for me.
You can't break a man the way you break a dog or a horse. The harder you beat a man, the tougher.
So you're not one of them. I'm Ruben Olwagembi, what you call a stringer, and you are new. I can tell by the state of your clothes. They're much too clean. You're taking a chance talking to me. I'm persona non grata around here. The warlords want me out of the country. They don't like the story I'm writing. It's about the war, and about them, of course. But mostly it's about the famous arms dealer, the Jackal. That was him on the tape. Do you know I have covered 16 wars across Africa? 16. And every time he has been there, selling his weapons. I meant what I said about the tapes.
Just a fun little glitch that happens there at the end. So in our initial encounter with Ruben, he hastily gives us a mission to go take the recording of the Jackal, who is the game's antagonist, to a priest in Pala. Doing so will help us get the malaria medicine we need. But he doesn't even introduce himself until you talk to him the second time. And he gives you a lot more detail about his role, his backstory, and his character motivations. And so it's this added detail isn't necessarily pertinent to your mission, but it does help frame the world and set up some expectations for the conflict ahead. So the detail in this exchange with Ruben helps set the stage for later plot points. It establishes the NPC as a pivotal character and a trustworthy ally for gathering information and reporting on events around Port Soleo, one of the main locations in Far Cry 2. Though this specific interaction doesn't have like choice-based branches or kind of branching narratives like modern games, some of which we'll look at, returning to him in the scene is a choice in and of itself. And this is actually the heart of the layer cake technique. So the first encounter is the most basic information, but each additional encounter provides an added layer of detail. And so stories of all kinds have details, whether it's dense prose or nuanced inflections or one-line descriptions, right? However, not all readers actually want details. The balance between information and details is a tightrope walk that I struggle with constantly in my own writing. And so for Redding and O'Connor, the narrative team understood that the story needed to be organically integrated into the gameplay, and that if it was forced, particularly upon players not used to narrative-driven content in first-person games, then the underlying messages they wanted to convey might actually deter players from engaging. So the layer cake technique not only provides gun-ho players to get the immediate information they need to advance objectives, but it also rewards interesting players with additional details that enrich gameplay. And in a subtle design maneuver, the Far Cry 2 narrative team shows the player that an engaging story, as we all kind of know now, actually makes a game better. When you offer details, you offer more opportunities for deeper connection to the experience. And there's been a lot of advances to this technique, right? In the first iteration, there is a notable lack of player input. There are no branches, there's no routes, there's no opportunities for the players to shape the story and actively dive deeper into the layer cake through direct dialogue options. And many studios have built incredible systems for making dynamic, agency-rich stories. And very, very widely speaking, general audiences have become much more literate. Folks, again, broadly speaking, are more willing to entertain dense story within AAA titles, so much so that it's really become a default point of critical reception for a game's success or not. But I want to celebrate the layer cake method because it offers a creative opportunity for designers and writers like you to think about how to parse their story into bite-sized chunks. Again, not all readers are looking for detail. Sometimes they are just trying to sleepwalk through their story. So how then does one go about implementing this technique in small, incremental ways? So you first do this by starting with the most pertinent information. You give the player an immediate hook that requires a decision and or activates a gameplay mechanic. You start a quest, you add an NPC to your journal, you unlock a map marker, whatever it might be. Then you use what Emily Short would describe as a waypoint narrative technique. And players can choose topics, but specific triggers either unlock another layer of the gameplay mechanic, so it could be like an optional side quest or a journal detail, or move the narrative towards a specific outcome or conflict. And then each additional layer after that is pure story. It's in those kind of deeper layers where the flavor of your cake is really baked. So it's important to note that layer cake narratives can stack high, but they can't really stack wide. And this is to say that this method usually requires building off recently obtained information. So rarely would you use this method to stretch stories and stretch across entire stories, right? You wouldn't use this in something for a whole character's backstory. You would really want to package it in small incremental scenes that are really kind of tight and sharp. So yeah, layer caking a central protagonist's entire narrative arc is probably not optimal, but you could use it for a particular beat, right? A story beat that reveals a secret or a backstory or a pivotal plot point. And it might be no surprise to you that some of the examples that I'll point to fall within what I would kind of consider an otherwise boring gun game genre. And they're far from like the experimental or nuanced stories that you maybe want to design or have even played, right? But I'm highlighting these games becomes one of the origins of this technique, but also of its mechanical composition. So linear first-person games that employ checkpoints, missions, quests, that type of stuff, they really benefit from this form of storytelling. And even without putting a gun in the player's hand, linear stories can be more easily told with varying degrees of detail given layer cake techniques. Okay, so let's look at another AAA example.
If you're hungry, there's meat turning on the spit outside. If you're bearing illness, find a place to lay your head down and I'll fetch you a poultice. Whatever your troubles with Edgewater, leave them at the gates and be welcomed here. Any questions, dear? I have been called that, among other things. Green Thumb, grandmother, the strange old lady who keeps flowers. But yes, Adelaide will do just fine.
Excuse me, Miss McDevitt? Sorry, it's just... You got such pretty trees in here.
Why, thank you. You're Robert's girl, aren't you? I remember when you were but a sprout. Thomas speaks of you often. Are you staying long? You should try some of my tobaccorn tea. I brew it in an old spittoon, but it's been cleaned. Reed Thompson, you here on behalf of that cold-eyed reptile? Let's hear it. What's Reed's idea of peace, then? Make amends. Spare me. Only thing Reed knows how to make is a mess. Like everything else that comes out of Edgewater, that peace offering is canned. I and my own are living just fine out here by ourselves. You're doing this for Reed? Why? Cannery's got a regulator. You want ship parts, you ought to rip them out of the cannery's guts and leave us be. If you're going down to the plant, you should divert power away from Edgewater and toward our end of the grid. Think about it. You'd be liberating an entire town from a lifetime of service to that odious cannery. Seems the sort of thing a hero would do. A hero to the people who matter. To us. To the ones who come around. To the ones you save. Reed will never understand. He has been too long inebriated on the wine of corporate culture. All he sees is productivity, output, profits. You've seen that miserable excuse for a town with your own lamps. Hollowed out workers laboring their lives away at the cannery, living off whatever scraps Spacer's choice throws them. You know that's true, don't you, Ms. Holcomb? Your father died of overwork. His heart gave out.
He was tired all the time, sure, but he was old, ma'am, and he raised me all by his lonesome.
Look what they did to this child. Lost her family to the company, and still she defends them. It's not much of a living. Every single person in that town has sold themselves to Spacer's Choice. The company owns them. Body, blood, and bones. You've been there. You've seen it. All anyone ever does is toil over a cannery. They give their lives for some heartless corporation, and then they're tossed into a Spacer's Choice brand cemetery. So, what do you say? Divert power over to us. Shut down that abominable cannery for good. I trust you will listen to your conscience.
So, what I want to highlight here is how choices in Outer Worlds steer the player towards understanding the circumstances of an NPC in order to complicate the gameplay choices. And this type of complex storytelling, where the choices of the player extend beyond branching dialogue and spill outward into the game world, are an excellent example of using the layer cake method to make player agency not just affect NPC chatter, but fundamentally alter the story. So, not only is the layer cake method used to advance a quest, but it also provides the player with some much needed context for a larger plot. So, initially, you're given some initial information, but then Spacer's Choice, the overarching galactic corporation bad guy of Outer Worlds, becomes more of a focal point of investigation. So the smallness of this singular quest or dispute is also layered with details of a much larger interplanetary struggle. And Outer Worlds, in my opinion, is very cleverly written and designed because it gives impatient players immediate direction, but also gives curious conversationalists an opportunity to discover more. Obsidian, the developers of Outer Worlds, is a widely celebrated studio that successfully pairs story and gameplay. For me, the writing isn't like peak games writing, but the design is really, really first rate. Let's look at another example, and this time I want to look at an indie game with much more kind of lyrical prose. And what I want to show is an early sequence in the point-and-click Southern Gothic neo-noir narrative game, Norco. Okay, in this dialogue snippet with Million, your cyborg nanny best friend, you point the player towards their next immediate need, right? A fuse. But by also hinting at a missing phone call, the player is able to choose an emotional response to their brother's absence, which Million then goes on to defend. This is quintessential layer caking. So you give the player, right, the most essential information. And then after that, you want to find the fuse, right? And then after that, you add some intriguing details, the missed phone call. And that leaves open an opportunity for you to explore, you as the player, rather, to explore more. So you can discuss your family. Then Norco uses this technique repeatedly by giving players immediate tasks, destination, and story progression signposts peppered within optional dialogue that beautifully and playfully fills in the details of the game world. But what's really fun and interesting about this example and about Norco kind of at large is how it expands its use of layer cakes by tying the narrative to a specific in-game mechanic called the mind map. And so for those that haven't played this game, the mind map serves as a kind of living document unraveling the various pieces of the underlying mystery of the game. Though the functionality of the mind map is very similar to NPC dialogue, you interact within this space to uncover layers of the story in mechanical ways that provide the player with some strategic information about how to progress the plot. So the interior monologue of the mind map not only rewards players with new information, but it also reveals new gameplay routes. And players can interact within this mind map at certain moments to advance the plot. And they can also choose how deep to go into their map to unlock different overlapping storylines and relationships, as is kind of outlined here. So before wrapping up and kind of talking about these various examples, I wanted to offer some additional insights of how I've gone about doing this and attempting to implement narrative design techniques within my own projects. So by working with Ink and Godot, I've developed a pretty good pipeline, I think, for creating incremental storylines that encourage players to dig deeper into the narrative by tying their exploration with in-game resources. Resources are a design term coined by Tracy Fullerton that designate gameplay elements that players can control or utilize to overcome obstacles in conflict. These elements are typically used by players in a strategic or an intentional way, often forcing the player to apply critical thinking skills towards their objectives, as well as leading them to additional modes of player agency. So for a current prototype for an upcoming project, I've designed a workflow to pair two types of resource acquisition in the game: player knowledge and player ability. By giving the player more information and rewarding them for discovering new information, the player will hopefully feel encouraged to explore more layers of the cakes that I'm baking. But the trouble that I'm encountering, and maybe one that I want to caution you about, is not over quantifying the narrative aspects of the story, like what happens in, for instance, Quantic Dream's Detroit Become Human. You want to let the player achieve stated goals and quest lines without having to discover every aspect of the story or kind of showing them ways in which they fail to uncover all the story plot points. And this balance is something that I still have to experiment with and polish within my own projects, but the technical methodology I've designed to build upon this concept has been a really fun challenge to tackle in the development process. So as I'm growing my prototype and testing the limitations of this pipeline at various scales, and this is just a very, very rudimentary prototype of this kind of concept, I found that keeping my system modular and relatively agnostic from a coding perspective can be tremendously beneficial for the design process. And so using a combination of an event bus and observer pattern with custom Godot resources gives me a lot of flexibility to bake a lot of small cakes that can hopefully lead to a much larger meal. So seeing how that actually will play out is undoubtedly a talk for another day. And I'd love for y'all to keep in touch so that you can follow along how this is developing and see how I'm working through these ideas for upcoming projects. Cool. Thanks. And yeah, I'm happy to open it up to questions and answers and just talk about this process a little bit further.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicholas. Let me open up the chat. See if we have any questions. If you guys have questions now, put them in the chat right now, and then we will go through them. Kyle, there will be a recording, so we will have that. And then, Nicholas, if you just want to, like, if you feel like you want to share the slides themselves just for people to, go through that, more than welcome to. And then
Totally.
we can forward that.
Yeah, let me stop sharing my screen so that I can make sure that this is shared. Absolutely. Yeah. You can check it out here.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Gonna let people
Yeah.
comment in.
Come on, I know you guys have questions.
Yeah, I see like 2 or 3 people typing
Yeah.
furiously. So yeah.
Okay, we got our first question. As someone who is already using the layer cake technique, but having some of the smaller layers be written by my co-writer, how do I make sure the feel of the layers and the feel of the story as a whole remain consistent?
Yeah, that's a good question. And like without like kicking the can down the road too much, playtesting I think is like a good answer to that. Playtesting is kind of like always a good answer to that, and I don't mean to be so flippant, but I think making sure that that consistency is coming across between the longer arcs of a player's experience is definitely like a good way of doing that. But having some of the smaller layers written by a co-writer. So I think another way of doing that is creating a really good and concise, maybe narrative design document for you and for your team. Making sure that your character motivations are very clearly laid out, that the quest lines are very clearly laid out, what the end direction of certain character arcs are, maybe in broad strokes. You still want to give them some creative freedom and some creative opportunities to, insert themselves into the work, certainly. But I think that one thing that you want to do is that you want to make sure that you have some kind of master document that you want to point towards. And I think sometimes that can be done in really granular ways, and sometimes that can be done in much broader strokes to be like, this character is intended to appear at this moment in the gameplay loop to get the player from point A to point B. And that's what their main motivation is. How you choose to design that character and voice that character and give that player character different motivations can be up to your co-writer, right? But kind of setting some common ground signposting can be like a really helpful way of maintaining that.
Awesome. Let me move to the next question. When it comes to player understanding as a resource, is that something that can be reduced throughout the cake for the sake of surprises in the story, etc.?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hope that I'm going to interpret it correctly. But I think that an important note to just kind of reinforce here is that I think that this technique works really well with linear stories, like broadly. It can work in different ways, and you can think about how you can apply this technique to nonlinear storytelling as well, in terms of like conveying particular information. information as a resource within game design and like narrative design is a really tricky process because you're constantly wanting to pull the player through your experience and not wanting to reveal quote unquote too much of what is going on like in the early stages, right? There's like nothing worse than kind of encountering any piece of media and having a very clear sense of how you think it's going to end within the first like 10 to 15 minutes. So, the same is true for games, right? It's same for cinema and books, and it's the same in games, right? So I think that one way that you can kind of do that is to think about that level of detail that you're giving, and also to kind of lean on some good old fashioned literary techniques, things like foreshadowing, things like Chekhov's gun, right? Things like player intentionality, right? I think also something that's really that at least Susan O'Connor in talking about the execution of this type of technique often pairs this with is the twist, right? So there being some kind of, as you're going through to the deeper layers of the cake, that as you're gaining that more information, the choice doesn't seem so kind of like black and white, but there's much more kind of nuance and complications about what that choice might mean within the game world. Looking at the example of Outer Worlds, I think is like a good kind of example of that. Right, you're given this task by this kind of corporate townie who says, "Oh, this person deserted, and they're behaving in a way that goes against Spacer's choice, and they should be stopped." Right, and as a result of doing this, they're taking power and resources away from the town. And then you go visit that person, and they are delightful and kind and inspiring and wanting to make a real change in this community, right? And all of a sudden, they give you this kind of not quite ultimatum, but they do offer you this moment where they're like, you can choose to be a hero here, and the hero's choice looks like this, right? It's a very pointed way of making the initial task that was set before you much more complicated.
Awesome. That was a great answer. If anybody has any more questions, keep them coming.
Yeah, Kyle just said here, I'm just looking at the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Probably letting the co-writer know endpoints of where the story will lead also helps a lot, for sure, right? Thinking about those kind of character beats, you kind of can create some signposts for your co-writer, and then it can be up to them to think about how you want to weave the story to get to those various signposts. Yeah. And again, like, it's important to think about this technique as being something that is utilized best in the micro. Again, you can kind of stack your cake high, but you don't necessarily want to stack it too wide. If you're requiring the player to carry a lot of information from like one story beat to the next across a very long layer cake, that's a lot of cognitive load for the player while they're doing a lot of other gameplay things, right? Like activities and behaviors. So you want to make sure that you're reaching points within your narrative that are kind of solidified or like in place, that layer is set before you maybe like move on to the next layer in like a bigger arc of a character.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a couple more people typing, so I'll let you know when those come in.
Yeah, for sure.
Jared's
definitely.
agreeing with you. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Definitely. I was also thinking about if I was within one take where the players are gung-ho, have a completely different understanding of the task or morality at hand than the ones that go deeper, or even between later layers. Obviously, I'm more used to less linear storytelling, but I find information manipulation fascinating. Yeah, totally, right? Again, it's like thinking about that twist. This is a really great opportunity to use that nonlinear technique where you set the player out into an action, and then you make the consequence of that action have deeper ramifications than maybe the player was prepared for. And I think it's like, I think if you want to design in that way, doing that really early on in the narrative, it can be a really instructive point to the player to be like, hey, you have to go a little bit deeper to get the full understanding of what you're doing here, right? If you just go in guns blazing, you might have just like killed an NPC or done something like horribly wrong that can't be reversed, and that's going to affect the rest of the outcome of the experience, right? It's like, okay, next time around, I should probably be more careful with my choices or make an autosave or something like that so that I'm not just, blowing up the entire experience. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the first encounter of Undertale is a really great example of that. Yeah, it's why I included that slide in my deck. There's like a really great moment in Undertale where if you skip through one of the NPC's dialogue really quickly, they will never return. It becomes a hard-coded thing in all future gameplay or like game loops. They like leave forever unless you, I think, fully uninstall and then reinstall. But yeah, it's a really, really funny little meta game component by Toby. It's in the slide deck. It's oops, I can find it. It's near the beginning. It's one of the little frogs that you encounter in one of the main hallways as you're searching for Mama. Yeah, frog it. Totally, Emily. Diego says, any words of wisdom for releasing your own game, more specifically a narrative heavy project? Also curious how you tackled making a story for an audience that might be stepping away from gaming, as I imagine having a child eats up that free time. Yeah, it's a great question, Diego. I mean, the short answer is like doing really good market research, right? Thinking about what your comparables are for your game. If you are making a narrative game, seeking out other narrative games that are similar either in tone or audience or potentially in how could you say demographic, right? And then seeing, how they reach their audiences, if they were successful in reaching their audiences, if they weren't successful in reaching their audiences, and thinking about creative collaborations or opportunities for partnerships to, meet those audiences where they are. Sometimes it's like more straightforward where you're just like, oh, there's like this Twitch streamer that like plays the types of games that I am making and I want to get them to play my game. And, you could cold call them or you could do a sponsored stream or something. Those are kind of the more traditional marketing routes. But in terms of releasing a narrative heavy game and thinking about how to like reach those audiences, I think that being involved in the tools that are used within those communities can be a really helpful way to tap into where those audiences are experiencing their games and their gaming content. So, for instance, I use a tool called Ink, and Ink is a tool that's designed by this company called Inkle. And they made a tool that was funded by the Epic Games grant, or Epic Games Mega Fund grant, to create branching narratives. And it was basically a way of open sourcing some of the tool building that they were using themselves within their own projects. And so there's a big community of people that use that software and are really hyped about games that use branching narratives. So, being an active member within those communities, trying to contribute to those tools if you can, or if you are technically savvy enough to do so, or if you can't contribute in technical ways, offering tutorials or, being just an active member and supporting those tools. Twine also has definitely a big community for sure. So that could be another way of like capturing those audiences. In terms of like getting an audience of like people that are recent parents, right? The game Bundle of Joy is not actually explicitly intended to be for people that are going through the experience that you're making. The target audience for the game actually was for people that maybe are potentially expecting or planning to build a family, or on the reverse side, individuals that have had a family and are out of the doldrums of early childhood, child rearing, I guess, infant child rearing. There was a lot actually that went into thinking about how to reach those audiences and communicate effective messaging that wasn't like, do you want to relive the trauma that you had in those early months? But instead to be like, do you want to have a frank conversation about what that experience was like, and develop some catharsis about how oftentimes there isn't a lot of documentation of what that experience is like, then you can play this game. But I think like you're tapping into something that's really important, Diego, which is like really nailing down who your intended audience is, and then trying to think about games that are similarly or games that are comparably trying to tackle that same audience, and talk to the developers of those games about what strategies that they've used, and think about how you can maybe form ways of batching or grouping your games in a similar conversation. Yeah, or like in my case, like people who like WarioWare games. So yeah, so I sent it to a streamer who was like really into like minigame, like kind of somewhat obscure Japanese arcade minigame enthusiasm spaces, and they played the game on stream, and it was really fun. And they were like, "This is not content-wise the game that I would ever play, but the genre specificity, was really kind of it was a very particular twist on that genre convention, which was really cool because again, I don't think a lot of people in that space are like people that are actively building families or have built families. Maybe a little bit more of a general audience, though in a kind of niche genre. But yeah, so it was really great kind of getting their perspective and seeing how it was moving or interesting or inspiring to them. Yeah.
Awesome. And I actually just have a quick question, real quick. In your experience, like what is the day in the life of a narrative designer? Like what's it like for you?
Yeah, I think it can vary from developer to developer or studio to studio. But a lot of it for me is like working in spreadsheets and doing a lot of like planning. There's a lot of planning that goes into narrative design work, and a lot of things that you need to anticipate in terms of developing your story arc, right? It's again why layer caking is like so helpful as a tool, because it forces you to a certain extent to like get the very base information that players need in order to like advance towards the story arcs that you want. And then, kind of going back and once you've started to build that scaffold, to think about going back and adding those layers of detail. Usually those are in like Word documents or spreadsheets or in whatever narrative design tool that you're using. Again, I use Ink. So a lot of the kind of day-to-day is doing a lot of the planning work for thinking about how those story beats are going to land and where they exist within the larger game loop or game kind of play elements, gameplay segments. But I do think that also something that is a kind of day-to-day thing for me, at least, is doing tons of research, right? So I think oftentimes when you're working within a narrative-heavy game, you're dealing with some kind of content of one kind or another, and that could be a particular space, or it could be a particular time, or it could be a particular genre, or it could be a particular characterization and looking at how other people have done those things and researching the good, the bad, and the ugly of those different manifestations of what you want to accomplish in your game, and then thinking about how you can fold those different things into your own experience and tackle them in your own writing. It's also kind of a funny question because I tend to think of myself as being more of a technical narrative designer than a kind of straight up and down narrative designer because I do a lot of programming. I do all of my own programming for the most part. So my job, my day-to-day job is certainly writing out story, but also thinking about how I can make particular moments within those stories or choices within those stories advance certain moments in the gameplay loop, right? So, quest design for me is like a big kind of touchstone, or at least right now for the current project that I'm working on. So thinking about how you are going through a narrative story and at what moments are you triggering the next actions, and then how do those actions map to a larger gameplay system, right? So you could be like, clicking on a choice and that choice is advancing a quest, right? And then how does that quest then appear or manifest in, a journal or into some kind of game log of one kind or another? So yeah, a lot of the work that I'm do kind of on a day-to-day is doing system design thinking around storytelling beats, which requires a lot of planning.
That's awesome. That totally makes sense. Yeah. I think let's see if wondering since you spent some time at Pratt, have you ever been to Chef Katsu?
No, I have not actually. Where is Chef Katsu? I feel like maybe I have and I don't even know that I have. Oh, it's on Green. No, I haven't really. No, I mean, I haven't been there. No. But good recommendation. Good recommendation, Diego. Good to know around here. Yeah, yeah, so I don't know if I even said that, but yeah, I'm a current faculty member at Pratt Institute, based in Brooklyn. That's actually where I'm doing my presentation right now. I'm in my office. So yeah, I get a lot more lunch options than I do dinner options, just because of like family obligations, of course. So I'm not going out to dinner around the neighborhood as much. But yeah, I'll have to definitely give this place a shot.
Well, good recommendation, Diego.
Yeah, thanks, Diego.
If nobody has any other questions, then I think we'll end it here. If you guys, want to send, Nicholas, if they want to, if they have any questions later, are they welcome to message you, or how do you want that?
Yeah, I'm going to put this back up on the screen. This little QR code here is my link tree. That goes to all my socials. I think that there's definitely an email on there. Yeah, you can access some of my stuff there. I'm definitely also on Blue Sky. I'm pretty much like in a lot of social media platforms just as SA Games. Again, that's the name of the studio that I kind of run. So yeah, if you want to find me on any of those social platforms, you can look for SA Games, Nicholas O'Brien, and probably find me pretty quickly. But yes, absolutely, be in touch. Send me any further questions, or if there's anything that you want to talk about further from this talk, I'd love to keep the conversation going.
Awesome, we definitely will. Thank you, Nicholas, for coming. Thank you, everybody else, for showing up. And thank you for asking questions. Thank you, Nicholas, for answering them.
Of course.
And yeah.